I see people making so many mistakes with the diet, and that's because they don't really understand what composes a diet, so then they fall into the common pitfalls, and those mistakes that they make, well, they have some consequences to your health. So in this video, I'm going to explain what composes a good diet, the 5 properties, the 5-pillar system that I use here, and this is the same system that I use to design nutrition plans for all of my clients. So I'm going to go in depth on each of these and give you guys a good understanding. This isn't a 3 hacks to increase testosterone style video. This is going to be much more in-depth, a training style video, so you guys can see the level of thinking that goes behind into designing a perfect or close to perfect diet. So let's get started. The first pillar is the easiest for people to understand. They're making the fewest mistakes here, but granted, as you'll see when I reveal what's behind this black box, you will see that people are still making mistakes and maybe they weren't thinking about it in this way. So the first pillar is the choice of foods. You have to select certain foods and you avoid certain foods. So that is the first pillar. And the way that I like to think about which foods to select, which foods to avoid, is in these 3 things. The first thing that you would want to consider is which foods are the highest in nutrients. The next thing is which of those nutrients of those foods are easiest to digest. And the last point is which foods contain the least amount of toxins. So let's expand on these a bit more. In terms of nutrients, you want to be looking at which foods contain the correct fats, proteins, minerals, and micronutrients. Which foods are the highest concentration of these? And then in terms of the digestion, because you can't just look at the nutrients, and I'm going to tell you why in a moment, but you have to look at which of those foods which are high in nutrients are actually easy to digest. Which of those nutrients are in the bioavailable. So I have a few examples here. Let's look at a multivitamin. A multivitamin like this one that I pull up right here. This multivitamin, on paper, it contains every nutrient you'll ever need, right? On paper, this multivitamin is extremely high in nutrients. It contains a lot of minerals, micronutrients. Amazing. If you read this and you didn't watch my video and you don't have an understanding of nutrition at all, you would think, wow, I don't need to eat food. I'm eating, this has everything that I need. Look, 100%, 100%, 250%. But of course, that isn't the case because there's a few things wrong with looking at nutrition that way. Firstly, the nutrient form, the form of the nutrient that is in supplements might not be the one that is the easiest for the human body to assimilate. A very simple example is beta carotene, which is a plant vitamin A nutrient, versus retinol, which is in exclusively animal products. The retinol is much easier for the human body to use compared to beta carotene, which is converted at a much lower rate. So it's not easy to use. Therefore, doesn't matter if you're consuming loads of beta carotene, it doesn't compare to using retinol. And there's many other examples in this from the other nutrients in here. So that's on one thing. The one thing is the form of the nutrient. The next thing that you'd want to look at is, can you actually digest this nutrient? So let's say you had a food which has all of the right nutrition on paper and in the right form even, but just because it's in that form, it doesn't necessarily mean you can digest it. In the case of a supplement, maybe it lacks the enzymes that you need, the bacteria, which help to digest the food, the other synergistic nutrients, and a lot of complexity that is in a real food compared to a supplement powder. So you have to take a holistic view there. You have to look at the big picture and not just a single thing, such as the paper value of the nutrients. Let me give you one more example. Beans and rice. Now, you might think, well, why would you pull up beans and rice? Oscarvore does not eat beans and rice, and you are correct. But right now, I'm in South America, and in South America, they eat a lot of beans and rice. It's a staple food in this part of the world. And beans and rice, on paper, are a complete protein. They contain sufficient quantities of all of the amino acids to be classified as a complete protein. So if you didn't understand nutrition, you'd think, oh, I don't need to eat animal protein because I'm eating beans and rice. They got me covered, right? And of course, that isn't the case, because that would be true if you were able to utilize the proteins in the beans and rice. But you cannot digest the proteins easily. It's hard to digest, especially beans. That's why they give people a lot of gas. It's a sign that you're not digesting the food well. If you have gas, you have bad digestion as a result of the food. So just because these are a complete protein, it doesn't mean that you are digesting it. So as I said, you have to look at highest in nutrients, but in the right form, in the easy to digest foods. The last point when you look at the choice of foods is which foods contain the fewest toxins. Now there's 2 toxins I'm going to talk about. There's many others that you could go into, but just to give you some examples, foods which contain a lot of heavy metals, it doesn't matter if they are high in nutrients. If they contain a lot of heavy metals, you want to be avoiding them. The second point is the anti-nutrients. So anti-nutrients are prevalent in plant foods. and they have the greatest concentration of anti-nutrients. So just because a plant food might have a lot of protein, or say it has a nice amount of fats, but if it has these anti-nutrients, then the negatives of the toxins outweigh any positives of the nutrients. So that's why you got to take a holistic view, and you have to consider all factors, not just a single thing like, hey, look, I'm getting all of the nutrients I need in the supplement, I don't need to eat real food. That's not the case, because you have to look at all three of these things. So now let's go into the second pillar. And the first two pillars, you might be making not as many mistakes as the other three pillars that I'm going to go into, but nonetheless, it's important to cover this so that you're doing things accurately. So the next pillar is the quantity of the food. So you select the right foods, you choose the right foods, you avoid the right ones, but in what quantity should I eat these nutrients? Should I eat these micronutrients? What quantity do I need them? So I'm going to look at a few things here. So yeah, as I said, how much of these foods do you need to have sufficient amounts of nutrients? And the three mistakes that I'm going to talk about here, which I see a lot of people making, are as follows. The first mistake is overconsumption of carbohydrates. In our society, all around you, maybe you yourself watching this video, people eat so many carbohydrates, they almost addicted to them. Croissants, pizza, rice, pasta, bread with every meal, etc. So people eat a lot of carbohydrates. Now the question is, why do they do that? And there's two main reasons. Firstly, this is a very valid reason, by the way, is taste. Something can taste really good, and that is enough of a reason for someone to do that, no problem. Croissants, pizza, rice, pasta, these things taste nice. They give you a lot of dopamine. So that is one reason why. And I can tell you, as someone that eats very few carbohydrates, just based on my personal preference, I've had pasta probably 5 times in the last 3 to 4 years. I can tell you that whenever I do that, I still enjoy it a lot. It gives you a lot of dopamine, those foods. They're very, very nice. They're addicting just based on the dopamine. But that's not the only reason. The other reason that is interesting to look at is people consume these foods because they're actually malnourished. They have deficiencies. And so when you have deficiencies, you will have cravings, right? When you have a craving, your body is signaling that it is deficient in something. And carbohydrate cravings, and therefore what lead people to eat so many carbohydrates, in part is from deficiencies, especially a fat deficiency. That is one of the leading causes of carbohydrate consumption and cravings, is a fat deficiency, a utilizable fat deficiency. And so that is partly why people do that, because they don't eat enough fats. And that leads me to my second mistake that I see people making, is that they don't consume enough fats. And that's partly because they're not familiar with the idea that eating a large quantity of fats is actually beneficial and it's actually capable, or they don't find correct foods, formulas, recipes to be able to consume those fats in large quantities. Most people go through life and they eat 2 ounces of fat a day, maybe 3 ounces, which is like 60, 90 grams of fat a day, maybe 4, like 110, 120 grams of fat. If they're pushing it, maybe they're doing a keto diet or something like that, or they're having a some kind of junk food, which is a lot of fats in it, the wrong kinds of fats. But that's the only time people really eat, typically, a large quantity of fats. And so what you actually see in my experience with many clients, including my own experience, is that you can benefit greatly from consuming large quantities of fats. You really feel good in terms of energy, and you see other concrete health problems disappear when you increase fat intake. So you can even go pushing things up to 10 ounces of fat a day, even 15 ounces of fat a day. It's not out of the question. Now, that is as long as the fats are correct, and I'm going to explain more about what would compose a correct fat in this video as we go through the other 3 pillars. And of course, you need to be able to digest it correctly. Most people struggle with their digestion when you start to get into high quantities of fats because they don't have the correct digestion. So there's those factors to consider, but you can really consume much more fats, and most people feel better when they do that, as I say, when you're able to digest it and it's the right quantities in the right formulas. So that's the first 2 mistakes. Then there's one more mistake that I see. Now, this is a less common mistake, but nonetheless, I see this occurring. I see people doing this mistake still, and that is insufficient amounts of proteins. Now, this is definitely a less common mistake than these 2, and that's because now it's more trendy to eat large quantities of meats with the carnivore diet or the animal-based diet that people push and things like that. So that's less of a problem now. However, it is still very much a situation that I see occur frequently in people, is that they do not eat enough protein, and then they start, maybe they're conscious of it and they start Googling, how do I eat enough protein? And then they start making more mistakes. But nonetheless, these are 3 of the common mistakes when it comes to determining the quantity of food that I see. Now, let's get into the third pillar. Now, this pillar you might think that you know what you're doing, but this is a big area of mistakes for people, and that is the quality of the food. Now, when I say quality, you might think of, oh, organic foods, organic fruits. Oh, my meat is organic or grass-fed and things like that. And those labels are not wrong. They're a step in the right direction. However, quality really goes much deeper than that, so I'm going to show you right now. There are 3 areas that I'm going to talk about when it comes to food quality, and that is farming and production. So how the food is made, where the food comes from, how it's made, and that's if you're buying things from a farm, which you should be if you are trying to do a good diet, buying most things from the correct kinds of farms. Then you have how you store the food. So that's how the store that you buy the food from stores it, or how you, when you receive the food, how do you store that food? That is going to affect the quality greatly, as I'm going to explain shortly. And then the last point is how you prepare the food, right? So you've stored the food, now you go to eat the food in a meal. How do you prepare that? That is going to impact the quality greatly. So let me give you some examples. Let's go into the first one. The first thing that I would look at. Now, I'm not going to talk about organic labels because those things are a bit more obvious. Let's go a bit more somewhere that you might not have been considering before. All animals, in terms of animal products, all animals store toxins in the fat tissue. And so when you're consuming an animal product, that can include dairy, fish, and of course any kind of mammal, red meats and things like that, chickens, etc. All animals store toxins in the fat tissue. What I mean by that is that toxins from the environment, from medications that some countries are required to give to animals and so forth, at least from big farms and things like that. When you consume the meats, especially the fattier cuts, as I'm explaining here, from the medicated animals, those animals have received lots of toxins in that medication, unfortunately, or from the environment that they're in, the food that they're eating, etc. And so when they receive those toxins, that is stored in the fat tissue. So that could be, fat tissue means either the flesh fat, could also mean the brain. Now, I doubt many of you watching this are eating the brain, although you can do that if you wanted to, but also the bone marrow. Okay, I see a lot of people thinking that they're doing the right thing with the bone marrow, but they're consuming conventional animal bone marrow, and that is not a good idea, just based on the fact that a large amount of toxins are concentrated in the bone marrow. So you could think you're doing the right thing, but you're eating toxic bone marrow, so you're going to be consuming metals and other toxins in there, which I do not necessarily recommend. And this is just a study here, I won't pull it up, but here it highlights that this type of toxin is found in humans, and it comes through the food chain, and most of the toxins are stored in the adipose tissue, meaning the fat tissue. So all animals, including humans, by the way, store toxins in the fat tissue. So if you're eating, that applies also to dairy fat. I've seen studies where they find toxins and leach into the milk, in mother's milk, for example, in humans. And obviously that the same applies to if you're drinking any animal milk, that toxins will be in there. So that's one example. Of course, I could talk about organic labels, grass-fed, etc., things like that, but just to give you one example, which you might not have been considering. The next point about storage is freezing versus fresh. So many people are not familiar with the idea that freezing food actually damages a large quantity of the nutrients, the enzymes, the stem cells, the stem cell effect of the foods, the enzymes, and the bacteria. And so when you freeze food or you consume food which is previously frozen, you are missing out there. You are not getting the same amount of nutrients. If we have 2 people and one guy over 12 months is consuming only fresh meat versus the second guy that's consuming only frozen meat, well, at the end of that year, with the same amount of meat, the guy who has consumed fresh is going to be far healthier. I would bet that he would have larger muscles and he would just be in better overall health, energy levels, etc. So this is important to look at, especially over the long run, if you're only consuming meat which has been previously frozen. I know in some countries, let's say Thailand, Bali, other areas of the world, it can be challenging to find fresh, high-quality meats. Now, that's where you need some really good connections, and that is a big part of my program, which I can explain more about at the end of the video, where we help guys source fresh, unfrozen meats that have never been medicated, ideally. Same with bone marrow as well. There's one more area of the food storage I'm going to talk about. One more example. In line with freezing damaging nutrients, right? Anything, certain low temperatures, especially low temperatures will damage nutrients. And I don't just mean frozen, right? But one more example I'm going to give is that eggs stored in the refrigerator, they will lose some of the nutrients because they're very sensitive. So when you're only eating eggs which are stored in the fridge, that egg is going to be less nutritious, it's going to be harder to digest, and overall it's just not as good as having a unrefrigerated egg, an egg that's never been in low temperature. And most people don't know that, right? Especially in the US, places like that, it's not necessarily easy to find eggs which have never been refrigerated. Now that's where you need some good connections. When I was in the US, I was in Whole Foods and Ear One and those kinds of stores, and all of the eggs are refrigerated, and naturally in a store they do things quite aggressively, so it's pretty low temperature there. You're missing out on nutrients there. It's something that you would ideally avoid. Now, let's go into the third point about food quality that I'm going to talk about, and that is how you prepare the food or meal. The first example I'm going to talk about is having pasteurized food versus unpasteurized food. And you could talk about milk, unpasteurized raw milk. That's very trendy to drink these days, and that's a good point. People are becoming more aware that the benefits of raw milk, and that's a good thing for most people to be drinking unpasteurized milk. They're going to observe some benefits from doing that as long as they're able to digest it. They don't get skin problems, etc. Pasteurized milk is one, but that's not the example I'm going to talk about, right? I'm going to talk about something which you might not have been thinking about, and that is coconut water. I'm going to even go organic coconut water. Coconut water, in theory, or is in reality a health food, right? But is this the same thing as drinking a fresh coconut? Absolutely not. Let me explain. I see entrepreneurs all the time. They post coconut water onto their Instagram stories or whatever, and they think they're doing the right thing, right? They're making an effort. They've selected the right food, but because they haven't considered the quality of the food or the storage or how the food is prepared, they don't understand that, and therefore they're consuming actually a toxic food, because anything that has a long shelf life has been pasteurized. Pasteurization is the process where you heat food to a high temperature. This could be milk, could be other foods that are pasteurized, coconut water like this. And so when you heat it, you destroy a lot of the bacteria, which is then extending the shelf life. So it's for a practical reason, which is understandable. And so when you pasteurize something, it will create toxic byproducts. It will destroy the bacteria, destroy the enzymes, destroy and denature the nutrients. So you don't want to be consuming pasteurized food. Personally, I would avoid all pasteurized food. That's my personal preference. And if you're consuming this, you think you're doing the right thing, but you're going to be having toxic byproducts. And so, yeah, it's important to be aware of the food quality and not just the organic label, right? Because look, this is organic label, and you think coconut water, amazing, 100% pure, no other ingredients. Maybe it's even in a glass bottle, and you think, I'm doing the right thing. But you didn't watch Oscarvore's video, and you're drinking pasteurized coconut water. That's not a health food, that's a toxic food. Let me give you one more example in the preparation. And it's going to be on the thread of these juices, actually, and coconut water. So that is cold press. So imagine you watch Oscarvore's video up until now. You've watched my video. You've applied the things that I'm saying. But you didn't watch the rest of the video. You turned the video off right now. And then you go to the store and you get yourself a HPP juice because you think, hey, look, this is cold pressed, fresh. It must be good, right? It's organic. It has everything that I need. Well, this could be any other kind of juice, right? I wouldn't necessarily say drinking coconut milk and so forth. But anyway, let's say this is a nice watermelon juice or something. And it says fresh, cold pressed, complete, everything that you want, organic. But you don't watch my video and you don't understand that high pressure processing, HPP, is also toxic because they do HPP to preserve the food for a longer time frame and extend the shelf life, but they don't heat it, right? So HPP is that process where it's aggressively pressed in order to remove the bacteria so that it extends the shelf life, but it doesn't apply heat, which can also have the side effects of food doesn't taste as good, right? So they use this hack as a way to kill bacteria without necessarily damaging the flavor of the food as much. But in that process, the bacteria is very important. You're not going to digest the food so well. You might drink a HPP juice and it feels heavy in your stomach. And so that's why it's important to understand in detail the food quality so that you're not making these mistakes and consuming a product which is toxic, difficult to digest, or just doesn't have the nutrients that you could be having if you were having a freshly made juice. So that is the key points I'm going to talk about for food quality. Now, as with all of these pillars, I could make a 3-hour video for each one, but I'm not going to do that because no one's going to watch that right now. Maybe if you're interested, I can, and that's something that I go over with all my clients. If they're interested, they have those ability to ask those questions and get that information. But you can see that there's many more layers I could talk about. I'm just going to give you these examples within these three, areas of production of food, storage of food, and how you consume it. So let's get into pillar 4. Now, pillar 4 is particularly interesting for entrepreneurs, and I say that because it's about the timing of the food. And the timing of the food, meaning what time of the day you consume the food, is going to either increase or decrease your energy levels. And so you can use food strategically to have more energy or less energy. Now, when would you want less energy? Well, let me give you an example. Red meat. Red meat can be very stimulating. It can stimulate hormone production, the adrenal glands get going. And so that can be a great food to consume earlier in the day because the red meat gives people energy. But if you weren't aware of this, you maybe didn't watch my video and so forth, you might have struggle falling asleep because you're consuming red meat late at night and you don't understand that the timing of the food is going to increase or decrease your energy levels. So let me give you an example. I was with my friend Arlen, also a client of mine, you might be familiar with him, in Dubai. and we went for some late night steak tartars, as I like to do, one of my favorite dishes. And he texts me later that night around 3 a.m. saying, hey, I can't fall asleep. I feel very, very alert. And I explained to him, well, red meat can do that to some people, especially when consumed fresh, like in a steak tartare. It can make you very, very stimulated. So having that late at night for you might not be a good fit. You might want to look at having other kinds of meats, fish, chicken, etc. White meats, might be better suited to that individual. So that's why it's important to be aware of these things. It can obviously have an effect on your energy levels. It makes your sleep bad, so then you don't wake up feeling refreshed, and that's going to affect your output for the day. So that's something to consider. The next example I'm going to give is on the opposite end of the spectrum, and I like to use extreme examples to highlight the point, right? And that is fatigue from carbohydrates. So imagine you wake up in the morning and you eat a big plate of pasta or a risotto, something like that. That food, is it going to give you energy? Probably not. It's probably going to give you less energy than you had before you ate the food. You might start yawning, feeling like you want to lie down. And so consuming a lot of carbohydrates, especially starches, early in the day, can make you feel very sleepy. And then it's negatively going to affect your work. So you want to time those carbohydrates strategically so that you're not negatively impacted in your energy levels, in your work output. And there's many more examples. Again, these are just two on the other opposite ends of the spectrum to highlight my point. So that is the fourth pillar. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. Now let's get into the last pillar. As I say, this is where I see people overlooking it a lot. And this would make a great difference if people understood this and, of course, implemented it correctly. And that is the combination of foods. That means which foods you eat together or close to each other. That is the fifth pillar that I'm going to talk about. Because when you eat certain foods together, it's going to increase the digestibility of the food. Compared to eating other foods together, it decreases the digestibility of the food, of the nutrients of the food. And so you're not getting the same ROI, let's say, from the food that you're eating. Now I'm going to give you a study to highlight this point. There is this study done where they measured the zinc absorption from oysters when you isolated the oyster by itself compared to when you eat oysters with other foods. And they used black beans, which is one of the foods I talked about earlier, and tortillas. And so you can see the absorption level of zinc was far lower when the oysters were paired with foods, plant foods, especially with the anti-nutrients, compared to when you isolate the oysters by themselves and have them as their own food. Now let's go into some other examples. And this is the mistakes that I see people making. So I don't think many people are consuming beans and oysters, although probably some of you are doing things like that, or oysters and tortillas, or you eat oysters as a starter and then you get a big plate of pasta. The graph would look something like this. But let's get into some examples which might be more applicable or relevant right now. The first example I'm going to give you is that consuming meats with fruits, salads, or the juices of either fruits or vegetables. This is a problem because human digestive system, to digest protein, you need an acidic environment to digest the protein. But when you consume these fruits, salads, or juices, it creates a very alkaline environment in the digestive tract, in the intestines, and therefore you're not going to digest the food so well when they're consumed at the same time. And you see people all the time eating, steaks with bananas nowadays. It's very trendy to do things like that. And that is definitely something that I would personally be doing or recommend to someone. And that can lead to, as I say, you're not going to digest the food so well. And that's not including also the fiber. If you're eating meat with a lot of fiber, as you have in fruits, even if the fiber is easier to digest, nonetheless, that fiber is going to interfere there. So it's better to separate those foods. For that reason I explained here, this is a really good study done. There's many more studies like this you can find. The next example I'm going to give is drinking too much water with food. This is a situation which you might find yourself in quite frequently, perhaps. You go to a restaurant and you're a bit hungry. So you sit at the table, the waiter brings you some drinks immediately. So there you have 1 cup of water, maybe 2. He then goes away, comes back 5 minutes later, he orders your food. He takes your order of food and you're waiting for your food 20, 30, 40 minutes. In those 20, 30, 40 minutes, you have probably drunk 2, 3, 4 cups of water. Maybe you've ordered another bottle of water to the table. So by the time your food comes, you have diluted your digestive fluids so much, right? Your stomach acid has been diluted with water so much that you're not actually going to digest the food very well. It's going to interfere. You might even have some stomach problems there as a result of consuming too much water with food. And just to expand on this acid-alkaline point, water also creates an alkaline digestive environment, which is going to then interfere with the digestion of proteins as well. So there you have it, the 5 pillars. You can see how you might be thinking you're doing the right thing, but unless you take a look at or consideration of all of these properties, there's a high probability that you're making some mistakes. So this is the exact 5-pillar system, the properties that I look at when I'm designing all the diets and nutrition plans for my clients. So if you guys want help figuring this out rather than trying to figure out yourself and falling into all of those common pitfalls that I talked about and the many that I didn't talk about today, then you can apply for my program using the link below. We'll help you not only select the right foods, but we'll also help you source the foods in the location that you're in so that you're getting the highest quality possible foods. That's a huge part of my program. I have a team of people that just email suppliers. So they're emailing people to verify, hey, is this juice cold pressed, HPP processed? Is this meat frozen or not? Can we arrange fresh unfrozen meats, etc.? So I have a team dedicated, full-time employee that is an expert, and he's very much applying these pillars to email suppliers for you. So you don't have to think about any of that. That is a great service, and people really appreciate that part of my program. And of course, you just want to get all of these things right. You don't want to be making these mistakes. The opportunity cost is there. You're going to be doing things which are actually damaging your health, and you're just delaying the process and accumulating toxins, if you're especially on the quality side of things, very important to look at. So thank you guys for watching. God bless you, and see you in the next video.